Thank you, David. It's really flattering to this many people to come out on a rainy day to hear about Maimonides. And when I look at this crowd, I have to wonder, can the Messiah really be that far off? It's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to come to the University of Toronto, see old friends, new friends, city I'm very fond of. And depending on the outcome of the next election in America, the next presidential election, you may be seeing more of me. So we'll see how that works. All right. Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed is, I think, undoubtedly the greatest example of Jewish philosophy written in the Middle Ages. And let's go beyond that. I'd say it's the greatest example of Jewish philosophy ever written. And a lot of people would agree with me, but there's something really peculiar about it. And that is that the book's 800 years old, more than 800 years old. There's still no consensus about what the book is trying to do. And that's weird. If you look at other great philosophers, Aristotle, Descartes, Kant, Spinoza, and so on, sure, there are disagreements, but they're mostly about the fine points of how to interpret them. Right? That's what people like me get a paycheck every month for teaching about the fine points of how to read these people. But in the case of Maimonides, the debate isn't about the fine points. The debate is about the big picture. What is this book actually trying to do? So, is it A, defending the view of a God governed by metaphysical necessity with no involvement in human affairs? That's basically Aristotle's view. Is that what it is? Is it B, defending a God who exercises free choice and is involved in human affairs, the traditional Jewish view of God? Is it C, a synthesis of the two? Is it D, a mystical conception of God that only very few people are able to understand? Or is it E, a skeptical conception of God that nobody can understand? If you went to a conference on Maimonides, you would see people defending all of these views. So there is no consensus about what this great book is doing, and that's why I'm here today. I'm going to try to set you straight, and after 800 years, get you the real point, okay? So that's my promise. The basics of the book, if you don't know it well, it's actually a letter written to a student. It's a letter written to an advanced student who says that he's having trouble deciding between what his intellect tells him and what he has learned from Jewish tradition. Okay, so my guess is what this is really going on is that, as we all know, the Torah is full of anthropomorphic descriptions of God. So he reads that, and he's studied philosophy, knows that God can't be anthropomorphic, and he's having trouble making up his mind. So that, in a sense, the whole book is an answer to that. Maimonides says right off the bat, the book isn't for everyone. In fact, at one point he says, if this book isn't really making sense to you, I strongly suggest that you just put it down and forget about it. And I can tell you after years of teaching it that I've seen many people do exactly that. He says the book is not for the uneducated. There's no surprise there. But now he says the book is not interested in just the purely legal sense of the law. Okay, now he had already written the Mishnah Torah, 14 volumes on Jewish law. But now he says in the Guide of the Perplexed that he's going to give you the science of the law in its true sense. In its true sense. Well, what is the science of the law in its true sense? And he answers that in order to understand that, you have to engage in what he calls theory or speculation to really understand what the law is getting at, all right? So we're going to spend a fair amount of time today talking about theory or speculation, but if you want to have a way of understanding this sort of intuitively, we can use a parable that Maimonides himself uses, and this is called the parable of the palace. Okay, so we imagine a palace, and there are various stages that you could get. You have to get into the city, and second of all, you have to be looking at the palace. Then there are those who enter it. Then there's those who are in the outside rooms. Then those are in the inner rooms of the palace, etc. So you can think of this as a king's palace. But Maimonides is using this to describe what it's like to get close to God. That's what the parable, instead of a king, think about God. Okay, so there are those who aren't even in the right city. They're so mixed up. There are those who are in the right city, but they're not looking, they're looking in the wrong direction. Palace is here, they're looking there. All right? There are those who are looking at the palace but can't get in, and so forth and so on. And what he says is this: if you have studied the law and you observe the law and you accept correct opinions, okay? If your opinions are not correct, you're not even looking at the palace. But if you've studied the law and observe it and hold correct opinions, you are looking at the palace, but you haven't entered it yet. Well, you haven't entered it yet because you need theory or speculation to get in. Okay? So I'm going to try to get you in the palace today, all right, because we're going to do some theory and speculating. What is theory and speculation? In very rough terms, it's the sort of thing that Maimonides inherited from philosophy. You can't just hold correct opinions. You have to have the reason why. You have to know why you hold these views. You have to be able to defend them in order to get into the palace. Okay, now sometimes theory or speculation leads to certainty. So Maimonides thought there were certain things about Judaism that could be demonstrated. And the mark of a demonstration is this: when you have a demonstration of something, there's no debate over it. There's no room for doubt. So if you want a good example, think about when you were back in high school geometry, all right? There's no debate about the Pythagorean theorem. It's valid, that's it, boom, it's been demonstrated, no disagreement, let's move on. Now, what is it in Judaism that Maimonides thought you could have that kind of certainty about? Well, he says, really two things. First, the existence of God, he thought, could be demonstrated. And second of all, he thought he could demonstrate that God is not material. Okay? Now, if you are thinking of this in a religious context, Maimonides thought these two claims, that God exists and that God is not material, are basically what's involved in the first two commandments. The first commandment doesn't say thou shalt or thou shalt not, but he interpreted the first commandment, I am the Lord thy God, as saying that you are required to believe in the existence of God. The second commandment prohibits idolatry, which he said is captured by the fact that God is not a material thing. All right, why is God not a material thing? Well, says Maimonides, look, anything that's material is composed of parts. Okay, so if you've got a material thing, you have a top, you have a bottom, you have a left, you have a right, you have an inside, you have an outside, sort of. So anything that's material is composed of parts. If something is composed of parts, it cannot be one in the sense required by Judaism. Right? When we say the Shema, we're asserting the oneness or the unity of God. That can't be true of anything that's material. Okay? All right, it can't. This is my coat, is material. It's composed of parts. It's not really one thing. It's put. If you want to think of this in a different way, let's take a slightly different slant on it. Anything that's composed of parts needs something to put the parts together. In other words, you needed a tailor to put this thing together. Okay? So if God were composed of parts, God were material, there would have to be something superior to God that put the parts of God together. What would that be? It would have to be super God. If super God were composed of parts, who put the parts of super God together? It would have to be super duper God. Okay, this is absurd. So Maimonides says, look, it just cannot be true that God is a material thing, and therefore, again, he thinks it's summed up by the first two commandments, and he thinks that on these two issues, the existence of God and that God is immaterial, there really is no disagreement. I'm not sure he's right, because there are certainly passages in the Torah that do describe God as being material, but Maimonides said don't take them literally. But in his day, and he's saying, look, nobody really believes that God is a material thing. Alavai, it should only be. But okay, that can be demonstrated, and there, a theory or speculation gets us to certainty. But wait a minute, it doesn't always get us to certainty. Sometimes theory or speculation doesn't completely resolve the question. So I'm going to give you 3 examples. We're going to go over each of these. Is the universe created? Did God create the universe, or is it eternal? Well, Maimonides says philosophers have been debating that for 3,000 years and still haven't made up their minds. Okay, in the year 2019, they even add more, 800 more years, 3,800 years. They still haven't made up their minds. The issue isn't completely resolved, which means there could not have been a demonstration of it. It's still, to some extent, an open question. Okay? Prophecy. What is that? How does God communicate with human beings? Well, there too, Maimonides thought unfortunately, we can't have a demonstration. I'll tell you why in a few minutes. And finally, providence. Does God take notice of human action? Again, Maimonides had views, which I'll tell you about, but he didn't think that theory or speculation led to a certain result. Now, I hope you can see creation, prophecy, and providence. These are critical issues for understanding Judaism. These aren't out on the margin. This is right at the heart of what this religion is all about. And what he's saying is we have to follow theory or speculation even though it doesn't give us a certain answer, let's say a logically certain answer. Now, there's good news here. The good news is, in my view, religion shouldn't work like geometry. I think that whole view of it is right. Religion shouldn't work like geometry. It shouldn't just be, here are the theorems, the postulates, and I can deduce the result, and if you don't agree with this result, you're an idiot. That's how geometry works. Religion should involve, I think, some element of human choice or human decision. Okay, that's really what it's about. And notice there is no element of choice in geometry. If I give you the theorem, the axioms and the postulates, the theorems follow immediately, and there's no room for choice. I don't want to see religion work like that. If it did, it would be too dogmatic. I mean, it would just tell you we got a certain answer on everything, and we proceed like Euclid. And if Maimonides is arguing against that, which I think he is, hurrah for Maimonides. Okay? But there may be some bad news here. Maybe some bad news. To get into the palace, not just to look at it, to get into the palace, we have to engage in something that's going to leave some critical questions unanswered. There is no other way to get into the palace. So to get into the palace, you're going to have a certain amount of conceptual flexibility, and you're going to have to recognize that the question hasn't been completely settled. Now, why is that? Well, to understand that, we have to understand Maimonides' view of human knowledge, in particular the limits of human knowledge. So let me read you a couple of brief quotations. He says the following. He says, sometimes, notice the qualification, I'll read it slowly. Sometimes truth flashes out, so a lightning flash, to us so that we think it's daylight. And then matter and habit in their various forms conceal it so that we find ourselves again in an obscure night, almost as we were at first. What he's saying here is, if you think of a thunderstorm, you get a flash of brilliance, now I see it, and then all of a sudden it goes dark again. And that's how human knowledge works, according to Maimonides. Now, if you remember back to your, if you took philosophy as an undergraduate, which I hope you did, have you ever read Plato's Republic? How many have read Plato's Republic? Yes! I tell you, the Messiah is not far off. Okay. Plato's Republic, in the allegory of the cave, if you remember that, the escaped prisoner comes out from the cave and first can't look directly at the sun because his eyes aren't accustomed to the light. Remember that? But eventually, the escaped prisoner in Plato's cave is able to look up directly at the sunlight. That's not true for Maimonides. Let's stick with this metaphor. We're not looking directly up at the sunlight. For Maimonides, we're getting momentary flashes, as in a thunderstorm, and then it goes completely dark again. So Maimonides on this issue is in many ways much more skeptical than Plato is. Now, what if you do get a flash? What if you're a prophet? Or what if you're one of the intellectual elite and you have suddenly got this flash of insight about the nature of the universe or God, or man's place in the universe? Okay, what does he say about that? Quote, know that whenever one of the perfect, these are the people who've got the flash, not all of us do, one of the perfect wishes to maintain, either in orally or in writing, something that he understands of these secrets, the secrets of the Torah, the secrets of philosophy. He's trying to explain what he or she has comprehended by virtue of seeing this flash of insight. What is the problem? They're unable to explain with complete clarity and coherence even the portion they've apprehended as they could in the other sciences. All right, so even if you're lucky enough to get a flash, when you start to explain it to somebody else, you're going to trip up. You can't explain it with complete clarity and coherence as you could in the other sciences. Now, he's running into a problem here because there are people, and I've taught people like this for years, there are people who come to class and say, unless you can prove it, I'm not going to believe it. Unless you can show with certainty, all right. Well, that's no way to live life. I mean, how much can really be known for certain? But he's running the risk now by being so cautious about what we can possibly know. He's running the risk that somebody's going to say, well, if I can't know for certain that all of Jewish tradition is true, I'm going to throw it out, throw out the baby with the bathwater. So he's running that risk, and what he's got to say is, and he does say is, this book is intended for somebody who's not going to have that reaction, not going to become disheartened, able to deal with uncertainty. Quote, the guide is intended for a religious person for whom the validity of our law has become established in their soul and it's become actual in belief. In other words, you have to have a pretty solid foundation in order to start this theory or speculation. It isn't just meant for anyone. Okay. So then, what is Maimonides doing in the book? And here's what he said. This is a funny answer. He says, my purpose is that the truth be glimpsed and then concealed. Just again, the lightning flashes, boom, then darkness. Because my purpose in writing the book is that the truth be glimpsed and then concealed. Why would a person write a book in order to conceal the truth? That's crazy, no? Well, Leo Strauss, the famous interpreter, and we have an expert on Leo Strauss sitting in the front row, thought that the reason Maimonides had to conceal something was that his message was too dangerous to let out. That if he really let out everything, too many people would leave Judaism. There's a dangerous message, and therefore he had to conceal it so that only a very few people would understand. I don't think that's right. In all respect to Professor Strauss, I think the answer is actually much deeper, and that is, it's the nature of the subject matter. It isn't that Maimonides is deliberately concealing something. It's that it's the nature of the subject matter that we get insight and then darkness, then insight and then darkness. So he's giving you the subject matter as it is in its natural way, not that he's trying to hold back anything. Again, for Maimonides, don't think that these secrets, these great secrets, are fully and completely known to anyone, because they're not. The best we get is partial insight. You may not like that, but he thinks that's the human predicament. So we're going to try to defend Judaism, Jewish tradition, with the understanding that all we get are partial flashes of insight. Is that enough? Or is that going to make you want to throw the whole tradition out? Preliminary conclusion. Preliminary conclusion. I think the book is about how to cope with the limits of human knowledge. How to admit these doubts and admit the lack of complete understanding and still remain faithful to the tradition. How to do that. But let's be honest, there's going to be a fair amount of unknowing. There's going to be a fair amount of unknowing by the time Maimonides is finished. It'll be interesting to see. Maybe we'll do a show of hands at the end. How many think that's it? I'm leaving the tradition. If it's that complicated, I can't know. Goodbye. Not doing it. I hope we don't get a lot. But all right, let's see. We're going to take up creation, prophecy, and providence, and I'll show you what the problems are. Okay. Creation. The issue of creation is this. Did God confer existence on the world? Did God grant us existence so that it's something we should be grateful for and praise God for doing? Or do we exist by a blind metaphysical necessity that not even God can control? Okay, now this is not a question of purely philosophical. This isn't just philosophers quibbling with one another. This is a serious question, I think, for any Jew. Why? Well, first, we celebrate creation every Shabbat, don't we? Zikaron Lamaaseh Bereshis. We are praising God for the work of creation. That, to praise God, suggests that there was a choice. That it wasn't just a metaphysical, blind metaphysical necessity, that God made a choice to decide to create the universe, and we are grateful for that. If everything exists by a blind metaphysical necessity, praise of God would be meaningless. It'd be like praising the Pythagorean theorem. I don't know what that means, because it's necessary. Can't be otherwise. So the issue of creation is one of those issues that goes to the very heart of Judaism. And Maimonides says that he's going to tip the scales in the direction of creation, but he can't guarantee that it's true. Okay? Now, I wrote a whole book arguing that Maimonides did believe in creation. It's called Maimonides and the Origin of the World. If you don't want to read the book, you can wait for the movie, okay? And I did my best at interpretation. A lot of people, very well-qualified scholars said, no, Seeskin, you're wrong. He didn't believe in creation at all. He believed in a blind metaphysical necessity. So as I say, there's not a lot of consensus on what he was trying to do. All right, why can we not prove for certain that creation is true? Why can we not prove for certain that God decided to confer existence on the world? Well, two reasons. First, Maimonides says, look, creation is a unique event. All right? No, first of all, nobody was there to witness it. It can't be repeated. It's a unique event, and therefore creation isn't like watching a chicken hatch from an egg or watching an oak tree come from an acorn. These are things we can observe. These are things we've seen 100 times over. These are things that science can study, but the origin of the universe is unique. We can't study it in a scientific manner like that. And therefore, there's no reason to believe, he says, that the causal principles that explain how a chicken hatches from an egg or how a oak tree comes from an acorn apply to the creation of the world as a whole. We just don't know. Again, I think he sides with creation. We can't prove for certain that it was a choice. Number two, when Maimonides discusses creation, he looked up at the heavenly bodies and the stars, the planets, and he raised the question, do they exhibit necessity? That's one side. The universe exists by a blind metaphysical necessity. Do they exhibit necessity, or do they show the result of choice? And the problem was that astronomy in his day was in a very bad state. It was 300 years before Copernicus. And the astronomical theories, which he discusses in great detail, basically, he says, don't really hold up. They don't hold water. So we don't know about the heavenly bodies. In fact, in a passage that I love, he says, when it comes to astronomy, he says, I'm as perplexed as anyone else. Well, this is the author of the Guide of the Perplexed, admitting perplexity on his own. He doesn't think astronomy is a real science, and in fact, he doesn't think it ever will be one. He quotes the 115th Psalm. I don't have to quote it because you all know it from memory, right? 150. No, all right. The 150. The heavens are the heavens of the Lord. The earth he's given over to the sons of man. The heavens, he thinks, are too far away, for us to really know for certain, and therefore, he says, quote, I'll go slowly, our intellects don't reach the point of apprehending how these natural things that exist in the world of generation and corruption came to be. Our intellects don't reach the point of knowing for certain how the world originated. Again, I have to emphasize, he thinks he can tip the scales in favor of creation, but that's all. That's all. It's not geometry. All right, so that's one down. Prophecy. How God communicates to human beings. Again, not a purely theoretical issue. This is a crucial issue. The whole Torah rests on the authority of Moses' prophecy. Unless we can have a coherent account of this, we're in deep trouble. He has a definition of what it's like to be a prophet, which is useful up to a point. Here's what he says. He says, if you think of the human intellect, right, we have reason and we have imagination. By imagination, it's just our ability to conjure up images of material things. Now, for most of us, when in sleep or daydreaming, our imagination gives us all kinds of crazy and incoherent things. We've all experienced it. You wake up in the morning and you got a song in your head because you somehow dreamt about this song or about a particular place, or anxiety dreams, all kinds of crazy images. I still get anxiety dreams myself. This is the truth flashing out. I still get dreams where I'm going to a final exam and I'm not fully prepared. I get them all the time, and once or twice I interrupted. I said, look, I don't take final exams anymore. I give them. You got this wrong. And then a week later, what happened? I showed up at the final exam. There were 100 students, and I didn't have a copy of the test. Smart guy. So for most of us, when sounds, images, dream images, daydreaming, it's incoherent, it's crazy, it doesn't. For the prophet, says Maimonides, that's not true. The prophet gets images that come from rationality, so that the imagination and reason are in complete coherence with one another. So when the prophet hears voices or sees images, they make sense. They're brilliant insights, unlike what you and I get. Now that's a good, so Maimonides is basically saying that prophecy is the perfection of the human intellect, when both of our faculties, reason and imagination, are in harmony with one another. That's not a bad definition. It doesn't work in every case, I have to say. Hagar is addressed as a prophet. There's no evidence that Hagar perfected her intellect. Balaam, there's a great deal of evidence that he did not perfect his intellect. He gets addressed. Okay, couple of exceptions, put them aside. But that's a good way of understanding the images that a prophet receives. There's only one problem, and that is that he says Moses' prophecy didn't work like anyone else's. Moses' prophecy was completely unique. The Torah says that too. The Torah says that Moses was the only prophet that talked to God face to face, that the others all, they were either angels or they were asleep or they were dreaming or something, that Moses' prophecy was completely unique. And therefore, wait a minute. Wait, slow down. What did we learn about creation? We can't be certain about a phenomenon, the creation of the universe, that's completely unique, because we don't have the categories or the principles to understand it, and we can't observe it. We can't see repeated instances of it, like a chicken hatching from an egg. Well, wait a minute. If Moses' prophecy is completely unique, then what's going to follow from that? And it's unlike any other prophet, which Maimonides insists that it is. The answer is, we don't really know that much about Moses' prophecy. We don't know exactly what it involved. It can't be repeated, and he was the only one who had it. Now, if you put Maimonides aside for a moment and read the Torah, just the actual Torah itself, Maimonides is right. It's not completely clear what happened at Sinai. Did the Israelites hear a sound? Did they hear a voice? Did the voice speak actual propositions? Did they hear God directly, or did they hear God through the intermediary of Moses? It's not completely clear from a reading of which one of these is right. So we can't be completely certain about Moses and Sinai, important though they may be. It's not that he's denying Sinai. He's just saying the true reality of it is, again, a little bit beyond us. Quote, "The true reality of that apprehension and its modality, namely Moses' experience on the mountain, are hidden from us. For nothing like it happened before, and nothing like it is ever going to happen again." It's unique. All right. Don't throw out the whole tradition. Let's just be honest about where we stand. Providence, God's knowledge of human activity. Now, when we deal with providence, there is a bit of a problem. I'll do my best to try to explain it, and it's this. The ancient and medieval thinkers didn't understand by knowledge what we typically understand by it. I'll explain. I could say in perfectly good English, and you'd all understand me, I know that I'm in Toronto. I know I'm wearing a green coat. I know I'm wearing brown shoes. I know I had eggs and toast for breakfast along with a cup of coffee. There's nothing peculiar about that. That's not the way that the ancients and the medievals understood knowledge. Okay? Their understanding of it was much more rigorous. They thought that to have true knowledge, you needed to understand something that was necessary and eternal, not something that we would say is contingent or happens by chance. Okay, so Aristotle, for example, says, we know a thing in the full sense when we know what it is, why it is what it is, why it cannot be otherwise than what it is. In other words, it has to be necessary. So the correlate of that, says Aristotle, is, I'll go slowly here, a little bit, fasten your seatbelt. We got a little bit of bumpy air. Aristotle says there's no knowledge of the individual in its individuality, or there's no knowledge of the individual as such. All right, let me explain. Just hold on. It could be known with certainty that as a human being, I need food in order to survive. I need nutriments in order to survive. That would be an eternal and necessary truth. It cannot be known with certainty what I'm going to have for dinner tonight. Is it going to be fish or fowl? Okay, so if you're following me, the latter, what is Seeskin going to eat for dinner, can't serve as real knowledge. What can serve as real knowledge are general or necessary truths. All right, now let's talk about God. God knows everything. But suppose I said, God knows everything that can be known. God knows everything that can be known. If you follow the Aristotelian view, it cannot be known what I'm going to have for dinner. In other words, facts about an individual, contingent facts, don't count as knowledge. Are we together? So, God, if that's the case, God wouldn't know whether I'm going to have fish or fowl. God wouldn't even know if I'm going to have a pork roast. I'm not going to, but all right, that wouldn't be known to God. Now, it's not that we'd be limiting God's knowledge. God knows everything that can be known. It's just that on this view, certain things cannot be known. They're just not. They're contingent. They're facts about the individual. Now, the question then is, how far does God's knowledge extend? Do we want to take the purely Aristotelian view, in which case God doesn't know anything about individuals in their individuality? God doesn't know whether you go to shul. God doesn't know whether you say your prayers. God doesn't know any of that because it's unknowable. Or do we want to say that God's knowledge, God knows everything, even facts about the individual? It's clear, I think, where traditional Judaism stands on this. Maimonides presents both sides of the argument, and I'm sorry to say he never really resolves it. Which is to say, he doesn't demonstrate one or the other. It's a tough question. He raises the question. If somebody can show me wrong in the text where he absolutely resolves this, I'll take you out to dinner tonight. Believe me, you'll be my guest. Get the finest wine. I don't see where he says that God knows everything. God's knowledge knows everything. But again, does that mean everything that's knowable in a rigorous sense of knowable, or everything without limitation. So we haven't gotten complete certainty on creation, on prophecy, or on providence. Now, here's what a lot of people think Maimonides either did or should have done. What they think is that if you can't prove these things, accept them on faith. Anima amin. Okay, philosophy can't demonstrate it, so you accept them on faith. Thomas Aquinas said that. Thomas Aquinas also believed that you couldn't demonstrate creation, and so he said, accept it as an article of Christian faith. I'm here to tell you that is not Maimonides' view. He never says that. In fact, I'm going to try to convince you that he says the opposite. Now, to go back just very briefly, remember, if you accept correct opinions on the basis of traditional authority, and you accept them on faith, you don't get in the palace. Remember that? You're looking at it, but you don't get inside. Sorry, partner. So he doesn't take that up. That's the easy option. He doesn't take it. Well, then what does he want from us with all this uncertainty? Here's what he wants. And my whole interpretation more or less turns on this one passage. Quote, if you stay your progress because of a dubious point, in other words, if you don't rush in, be cautious. If there's a dubious point, hold off, slow down. Hold your progress if doubts emerge. If you stay your progress because of a dubious point, if you don't deceive yourself into believing that there's a demonstration with regard to matters that have not been demonstrated, if there's no demonstration, admit it. Don't deceive yourself into thinking that you've shown something you haven't really shown. If you do not hasten to reject and categorically to pronounce false any assertions whose contradictories have not been demonstrated, in other words, your opponent's view, if you haven't absolutely refuted your opponent, don't claim it. Slow down. Admit your limitations. If finally you do not aspire to apprehend things that you're unable to apprehend, we've seen there's a lot we can't apprehend, you will achieve human perfection. No reference to faith in this, but in order to accepting things on faith. You will have achieved human perfection and attained the rank of Rabbi Akiva. Why does he mention Rabbi Akiva? Because he's talking about the old parable in which 4 rabbis were led into Pardes. Let's see if I remember it right. One became an apostate, one threw out the tradition. One committed suicide. One went crazy. And Akiva was the only one who walked in and walked out in peace. Why, says Maimonides? Because he was honest about his limitations. He accepted his limitations for what they were. So I'm presenting, in this sense, Rabbi Akiva as a Maimonidean hero. How do we cope with all the limitations that I have brought up today? Answer, accept them for what they are and don't try to exceed them. Don't take the shortcut of faith. Just if these are the limitations, what are they and why are they limitations? If he's right, God does not demand certainty on every question. That's the wrong way to think about it. What is it, if Maimonides is right, that God really asks of us? And I would say 2 things. Humility and epistemological honesty. Admit where you are. Admit your limitations. It won't hurt. In fact, If I'm right, it will get you inside the palace. Quote, the souls, when this happens, the souls will find rest, the eyes will be delighted, and the bodies will be eased of their toil and their labor. You will achieve human perfection. And in my view, that is the point of the book. What does that mean for us? Well, now you're going to get Seeskin. Well, I think it means God doesn't demand dogmatism. God doesn't demand that we pound on that we know everything, we got all the answers. That's not at all, if Maimonides is right, what God really wants. Now, some people say religion is supposed to be a beacon of security in a world of confusion. Maybe so. But don't let that become dogmatism, because if you get dogmatic, you've missed the point of everything that he's trying to do. Judaism does not provide a certain answer to every question. This is again Seeskin. It can accommodate disagreement, particularly on critical questions. You do not have to make a leap of faith to be loyal to the tradition, if this is right. You do, however, have to work through the problems. You do have to work through all of these issues. On that, there is no shortcut. You do have to do the work. So I'm going to end this lecture, as I often like to do, by quoting a Jewish philosopher who never got the credit she deserves, my grandmother, who used to say, schwer zu sein a Yid. It's tough to be a Jew. Thank you.